I've written a commentary on the book of Revelation, and it's actually one of my better selling books, for which reason I'm suspecting that Revelation is a very popular book. But some people think it's a very scary book. Well, it can be scary. It depends on how you're living. But it's been easily misinterpreted. People have a lot of interesting ideas about the book of Revelation. Sometimes it's popular for the wrong reasons. End time debates aside, Revelation is a very practical book. So if you look at some of the kinds of themes that appear in the book of Revelation, prayer is really important. The prayers of the saints are like incense before God, just like in one of the Psalms. The prayers of the saints move history. Also, the emphasis on worship. Heaven is portrayed like a temple. It's got the Ark of the Covenant. There's people playing on harps, dressed like priests. You have a sea of glass that's similar to the Sea of Bronze in Solomon's Temple. So many features of it. Uh, Revelation 15 talks about the tabernacle in heaven. 11:19 talks about the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. You have the altars of incense. You have the altar of sacrifice in 6:9 through 11. So heaven is portrayed as a temple, a place of worship. And when we worship God, we are looking to heaven in a heavenly perspective, as opposed to some of the less pleasant things going on earth in the book of Revelation. Suffering, Christians should expect it. The Spirit's empowerment for evangelism. We've got people running around in the book of Revelation described as prophesying and as witnesses for Jesus. Revelation 19:10 says that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. As we speak about Jesus to others and show the message of Christ to others, we can trust that the Holy Spirit will work through us. There's also a major theme, compromise versus holiness. So you've got two churches that are suffering churches in Smyrna and Philadelphia. They're the only two churches of the 7 churches in Asia Minor that aren't reproved for anything. But the other 5 churches are compromising to varying degrees with the same world system that's killing their brothers and sisters elsewhere. This is taken to a more cosmic level with 2 cities in the book of Revelation, the contrast between Babylon and the New Jerusalem. Babylon portrayed as a prostitute, the New Jerusalem portrayed as a bride. The idea that they're portrayed as women being sexist. Cities portrayed themselves on their coins as women. That was the standard expression back then. And some of this goes back to Old Testament imagery as well. Hope, after chapters 6 through 18, from chapters 19 through 22, or after chapters 6 through 20 come chapters 21 and 22. And it depends on the eschatological view. But in any case, it ends up with hope. It's not all about suffering. It's not all about what's sad. We have Jesus' pastoral letters to the 7 churches, very practical, how churches must overcome. In Ephesus, they need to regain their first love. In Smyrna, they need to be faithful to death. In Pergamum and Thyatira, they need to avoid compromise. In Sardis, they're said to be a dead church. They need to wake up, although there are some even there who will walk with Jesus and works of life, it says. Philadelphia, they need to endure suffering. In Laodicea, they need to stop pretending self-sufficiency. Pretty much they each have different tests. Just like we today, individually and as churches and as the church in different parts of the world, we have different tests. We don't get to choose our test. We don't get to say, I wish I had that person's test. That would be easier than mine. We also don't get to say, man, I'm glad I don't have that person's test. I don't think I could endure what they're enduring. We don't get to choose our tests. But we're all called to overcome. But first, some basic principles for interpretation. Most prophetic books are largely in poetry. It's because most of the prophetic books in the Bible were written before the exile, and those are largely in poetry. After the exile, a lot of the prophets prophesied more in prose, but they still kept using a lot of symbolic imagery, like you have in the earlier prophets who were prophesying in poetry. So don't always try to read everything literally. Some things turn out to be literal. It's often in retrospect that you find out which is which. Something else to look at was the prophecy fulfilled of it. Sometimes we look for its fulfillment, but it was already fulfilled. I mean, the Jerusalem temple, Jesus says it's going to be desecrated and ultimately destroyed within a generation. Well, that happened. It was destroyed in the year 70. Some people say it'll be destroyed again, which would presume it has to be rebuilt first. But certainly it was at least partly fulfilled. Some people would say completely fulfilled in the year 70. Some prophecies may have been partly fulfilled and partly future. The return from exile, Jewish people recognized that they'd come back from Babylon, but they also recognized that some of the prophecies about restoration were still future. There was more to come. Well, in light of these things, we need to watch out for prophecy teachers who claim that every detail is fulfilled in our generation. They make two assumptions. First of all, they assume that every detail must pertain to the last generation. That is wrong, as we can see from some prophecies that were already fulfilled and don't need to be fulfilled again. And another assumption is that we are the last generation. That could be right. I mean, phew, look at the world around us. But how do we know? Because many generations in history thought that they were the last generation. In fact, most believed that they were the last generation. And already in the New Testament, 2 Thessalonians 2, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. 1 John 2:18, you've heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists. No one knows the day nor the hour, Jesus said. That included Jesus himself. It certainly includes the devil. The devil doesn't know when the last day will be. And so he's always going to have at least one Antichrist figure in waiting. Many of the biblical texts are general enough to be reapplied in each generation to keep us on our toes, not to satisfy our curiosity, to keep us focused on the big picture, which does get fulfilled. For example, John prophesied the downfall of the new Babylon. Now, I believe the spirit of Babylon is still in the world today, but the Babylon of John's day, the evil empire of John's day, Rome, well, that fell like 1600 years ago. The church has outlived that empire by a considerable number of centuries. Prophecy teachers often interpret Revelation according to current headlines, which is why they have to revise their interpretations as headlines change. Dwight Wilson, in a book called Armageddon Now, traced through much of the 20th century how not just Jehovah's Witnesses, who are notorious with this, but lots of groups, including many really solid Christian groups, were predicting dates and predicting different things that would happen. And you go back and you look through the predictions, the vast majority of things they predicted did not happen. And these were prominent prophecy teachers of their day. Richard Kyle, in The Last Days Are Here Again, went back further and traced this even back to the early church fathers. Now, occasionally, the prophecy teachers have been right. Usually they've been wrong. One, and this wasn't so much about prophecy in the way we often think of it, but some evangelicals, when I was a young Christian, I read about them drilling for oil in Israel based on Deuteronomy 33:24, oil at the heel of one of the 12 tribes. So they figured out where that was geographically, and they went and they spent like $1 million drilling for oil. They didn't find any. They lost their investment, which could have been used for for missions, it could have been used for feeding the poor, it could have been used for all sorts of things for the kingdom. But, it would have helped if they had studied the biblical text first, at least looked it up in Hebrew, at least in Strong's Concordance. They would have recognized that it was talking not about petroleum, but about olive oil. Now, did other generations have access to current headlines so that they could interpret the text? A basic principle of biblical interpretation that we use everywhere else when we study the Bible is to read the text in its original setting first. It's one of our basic rules of Bible interpretation, cultural background. Revelation explicitly names its audience. 7 churches in Asia Minor. If you look at it on a map, the first place a messenger would go from Patmos, 40 to 50 miles to the northeast, would be Ephesus. From Ephesus, the nearest church was Smyrna, and so on, making the rounds to all 7 churches. Revelation claims that its first hearers could understand it. In Revelation 1:3, blessed is the one who reads the words of this book, and blessed are those who hear, because back then one person would read to many. They couldn't all read, and they didn't all have copies, obviously. So one person would read, the others would hear. Blessed is the one who reads, and those who hear, and take to heart and heed the message of this book. So at least the principles for application have always been available right from the start. Now, that's not true for necessarily everything in the Bible. Daniel chapter 12, it says, seal up these things because the time is not yet. But the last chapter of Revelation says, don't seal these things because the time is at hand. Revelation was meant to be understood by Jesus' followers. If today's headlines are the key, then no generation could understand the book well enough until now. But 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all scripture is inspired and profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. So again, at least the principles for application must have already been intelligible to the first audience. I'll give you an example of headline hermeneutics. The Kings of the East, Revelation chapter 16 and verse 12. Western evangelical interpreters of the Kings of the East in the late 1800s and early 1900s said this must refer to the Turkish Ottoman Empire because this was a threat to the West until World War I. It was East to its Western interpreters. But how would it have sounded to the 7 churches in Asia Minor? They were in what is now Turkey, and they would not have thought of the Turkish Ottoman Empire as being primarily to the east. Well, at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered, and until the end of World War II, Western interpreters were applying it to Imperial Japan. And Japan played a big role in World War II and so on. But at the end of World War II, the West became friends with Japan. And after World War II, it was applied to communist China, people thinking of the Great Red Dragon. But after détente, many people in the West said, no, it's not China. Well, in the first century, whatever people are saying currently today, in the first century, it speaks of the kings of the East crossing the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates was the boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. Parthians had recently invaded Asia Minor, so this was kind of within the previous 10 years, this was like ancient headline stuff, including for the 7 churches of the Roman province of Asia. They were described as having long hair and mounted in composite features like the ones you have in Revelation 9, but some of the features. They were ancient inhabitants of the region of Iran and Iraq. Now, I'm not saying that these will be people from Iran and Iraq. my point in this is it's using images that were intelligible in John's day. And in John's day, the most fearsome enemies of the Roman Empire were the Parthians. They were scared of Parthians. They were scared of Parthian invasions. Anti-Asian ethnocentrism is not godly, but this text has often been exploited by some prophecy teachers in support of anti-Asian ethnocentrism. When I say prophecy teachers, I'm talking about those who they pick and choose from texts based on current headlines. They're not really handling the text responsibly. They're reading the headline stuff into the text. Now, it's not wrong to say, oh boy, look at this that's going on in the world, and this that's going on in the world. Wow, this could fit. You know, saying it could fit is one thing. Saying this is that runs the risk of what has usually happened in history. It's usually been wrong. Headline hermeneutics often produces embarrassing results. David Koresh, affectionately known as the Wacko from Waco, had a unique interpretation of Revelation that led to the death of most of his followers. Jehovah's Witnesses predicted special end-time events. By the way, no offense against Waco, that was just him. I like Baylor University. But Jehovah's Witnesses predicted special end-time events for 1874, 1878, 1881, 1910, 1914, 1918, 1925, 1975, 1984. You notice it has slowed down. That's helpful. But also from Christians. Hippolytus said that the world would end around the year 500. Fortunately, he predicted it far enough in advance that he didn't live to see it not happen, and nobody could criticize him at that point. St. Martin of Tours declared that the Antichrist had surely been born. Martin died in 397. Perhaps the Antichrist has displayed remarkable longevity. People have continued predicting various dates for the arrival of the Antichrist. Things continued happening in the medieval period. The Catholic explorer Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World, but when he said he discovered the New World, he meant it in light of, hey, the new heavens and the new earth in the book of Revelation. He saw his mission as eschatological. Things kept happening in the Reformation period. Luther expected the end of the new century. Well, to say it might happen in our generation, yeah, it's all right. He could say that. Just keep in mind, it doesn't always happen exactly, but to him it looked like it. I mean, the Turks were on the horizon at that time. They were conquering parts of Europe, and the battle between him and what he felt were intransigent Catholics. Of course, the Catholics thought that Luther was the end of the Antichrist, but people thought that that was the end time. The early Puritans thought that the millennium ended around 1300, so hey, we're past due. Hey, the end should come soon. Anabaptist Melchior Hoffman predicted Strasbourg to become the New Jerusalem. He died in prison there 10 years later. Thomas Müntzer, who was like a 1500s liberation theologian, expected the peasant revolt of 1524 to produce the final judgment. Thousands of peasants died, and he was executed. Back then, end-time speculations died hard, sometimes literally. Thomas Helwitz, one of the earliest Baptist leaders, thought that persecution by King James I, by the way, if you're a Baptist and you still use the King James, just keep in mind that King James persecuted Baptists. But Thomas Helwitz thought that this current persecution was the Great Tribulation. Now, it certainly was tribulation. It just wasn't necessarily the final experience of it. 1700s, you have Quakers predicting the end. Jonathan Edwards felt that the First Great Awakening might lead to the end, fair enough. 1770s, many Americans felt that the Revolutionary War would be the final one, and that King George III was the Antichrist. Wesley, preaching in England, thought that King George was pious. Christians don't always agree on politics. But let's try the 1800s. Oh boy, I'm getting into some controversy now. You do have Christians like John Nelson Darby. This is where we get the idea that the church would be raptured before the tribulation. if you hold that view, it's all right. Just keep in mind, it's especially from 1830 on that the view began to be spread. The Millerites, they were really ardent believers that Jesus was about to come back. They set some dates that didn't happen. And then you have groups that are not really uh, Orthodox Christian, like Mormons. No offense if you're a Mormon, but uh, certain of your beliefs could be revised in light of Scripture alone. But anyway, Mormons came up with some interesting end time views. The impending civil war, many northern ministers expected it to usher in God's kingdom for the north. Many southern ministers expected it to usher in God's kingdom for the south. Effective urban evangelist William Booth believed that his Salvation Army was God's main means to establish his kingdom. And in William Booth's day, it was one of God's main means to establish the kingdom. William Booth was, I think, probably post-millennial, but trying to work for God's kingdom, that's a good thing to do. So I'm not trying to pick on one group. I'm just saying, look, we all have our hands in this. We need to stop doing this. 20th century foibles. In the 1920s, some of the prophecy teachers then found their views confirmed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which turned out to be a Russian forgery that was exploited by the Nazis in their campaign against the Jewish people. The 1970s, I became a Christian in the 1970s, mid 1970s, and one of the first things I heard in church was that there's this computer in Belgium known as the Beast, and it was the Antichrist. And I asked the teacher who was teaching this, are computers therefore of the devil? Now, we didn't have our own computers back then. Keep in mind there were these mainframes like NASA and other groups had them. But anyway, I said, are they of the devil? He said, oh, not all computers, just the one in Belgium known as the Beast. Later on, it came out that that computer in Belgium was in a novel. It wasn't actually a real computer. Salem Kurban emphasized that Henry Kissinger was the Antichrist. Henry Kissinger, I think he's still alive. But anyway, I heard another prophecy teacher on 1981 very firmly predict, based on a passage in Ezekiel, that the Soviet Union would conquer Iran and shut off the world's oil supply by 1982. It's a little behind schedule, but a very popular view was that Jesus would return within 40 years of 1948, hence by 1988. Hal Lindsey sort of pointed in that direction, but we couldn't nail him down exactly. But some other people were a little bit more vocal about it. 1988, Christians in the United States bought over 3 million copies of a certain engineer's book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988. Again, if you're an engineer, don't take this as against engineers. My daughter is studying engineering, and my brother who's an engineer. I like engineers, especially when I'm crossing bridges and things. Very grateful. But this person was not necessarily an expert in Greek, Hebrew, or whatever, which you don't have to be to read the Bible, but it helps before you make big pronouncements on things that, well, it would have been helpful to have studied them at least in more detail, at least with Strong's Concordance. Anyway, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988. I had a friend who worked in a Christian bookstore in 1988, and she told me that the bookstore owner said, sell as many copies of this book as you can before December 31st, because in 1989, nobody's going to buy this book. And sure enough, in 1989, very few people bought the revised edition. So it sold like 3 or 4 million copies before it sold out, the one from 1988. It didn't sell too well afterwards. Let it never be said that North American Christians are easily deceived 2 years in a row by the same person. Various prophecy teachers suggested times in the 1990s, there were these people in the airport that were passing out things. I tried to talk with them and said, don't be discouraged if it doesn't happen. They said, no, we won't be, but it will happen. And it was like, what kind of witness is this? If I mean, it could happen, and the Lord can come back at any time, right? But it didn't happen on their schedule. Various prophecy teachers suggested the year 2000, Y2K, but Jesus was probably born closer to 7 BC, so the people were arguing for the date around 1993 or 1994. If it was going to be the year 2000, they were probably closer. Early and modern predictors of times and seasons, as has often been pointed out, have shared only one common flaw. They've all been wrong. But didn't Jesus say he was coming soon? Yeah, but Israel's prophets had been proclaiming that the day of the Lord was at hand for 7 centuries at this point. By Revelation's day, those accustomed to the prophetic message understood that imminence means always be ready, not that it's going to happen tomorrow or that you can set a date for it. The kingdom in the New Testament comes in phases. The restoration from exile began when Persia sent the Judahites back to their land. In the Gospels, Jesus introduces a new phase of the kingdom. He says the kingdom is at hand. The final consummation, Jesus' return, for which we're looking, remains future, but God provides multiple foreshadowings and foretastes of that future. When did the last days begin? On the day of Pentecost, Peter says in Acts 2:17, in the last days, God says, I'll pour out my spirit. Should start back at verse 16. This is fulfilling what Joel the prophet said. And then he says that 1 Timothy 4:1, 2 Timothy 3:1, 2 Peter 3:3, 1 John 2:18, all of these speak of the last days, the last times, or even in 1 John 2, the last hour, and in context are speaking of their own time. We have been living in eschatological time, that is, in the end times, so to speak, for a long time. Now, it goes without saying that we're closer to the end than we were back then, but you know, it was already last days. So you're going to say it's laster days now? I agree. How could it not be? Some questions to consider when interpreting the book of Revelation. In what language was Revelation originally written? It was written in Greek, maybe a Hebrew accent, but written in Greek. To whom does Revelation claim to be written? Well, it claims to be written to 7 churches in Asia Minor. Now, some of the early dispensationalists, I have good friends who are dispensationalists. Most of them are progressive dispensationalists, which is different from when we talk about some of the early dispensationalists. But some of the early dispensationalists said, no, these are 7 stages of church history. But church history kept going after they were saying that, like in the late 1800s, and the which church was which had to be revised some. But we don't allegorize the church in Philippi or the church in Corinth in Paul's letters. So in the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation, there's no reason to allegorize those and turn them into symbols of something. We can relate to them. There are things we can learn from them, but we don't want to turn them into symbols. The local color, the things that are described about these churches, like the gross water in Laodicea, I mean, Jesus is relating to them where they're at, to their own context. So, you know, it makes sense. These were actual churches. I mentioned there's a lot of symbolic imagery and a lot of biblical prophecy. But letters we usually take literally. And it's kind of counterintuitive to take the letters symbolically and the prophecies all literally. So anyway, you look at a map, they fit the right place. So were the original readers supposed to be able to understand Revelation? Well, that's what we mentioned with Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3. How can you heed it if you can't understand at least its basic point? And again, don't seal these things up, Revelation says, because the time is at hand. So which of the following methods is most helpful for understanding Revelation? I think the history and culture of the first century matters when understanding Revelation. I'm not saying everything is fulfilled in the first century, but you know, it's written in Greek. we need a translation to get the Greek. Well, a lot of the symbols were perfectly intelligible, perfectly understandable to people in the first century. So it makes sense for us to, I mean, it's easier for us to go back and study ancient headlines than to expect people in antiquity to time travel to our time and read it in light of modern headlines. So there are various approaches to revelation. One is the idealist approach, which says it involves timeless principles. Of course, I do believe that there are timeless principles in revelation, but you could state timeless principles without being so specific on some things. So another approach was the historicist approach. This was really big in the 1800s, before the futurist approach, to where Revelation gives us a map of church history, corresponds to events in history before the end. And so looking back, we can read church history out of the book of Revelation. Of all of the approaches, this is the least commonly held today. The preterist approach, well, in its most extreme form, it's saying that it's relevant only to the first century, or even completely fulfilled in the first century. I mean, the most extreme form, Jesus even came back in the first century, and that's it, which doesn't seem to make sense to me. But anyway, but the preterists emphasize, let's look at the context of the first century. And so that is helpful to us. Just like the idealist approach contributes something, so do the preterists. The futurist approach, well, almost all of us agree that at least some of this future, clearly the Lord's coming is future, right? I mean, the New Jerusalem, I mean, we are the people of the New Jerusalem already. Some things are already not yet. But death still exists. Sickness still exists in our world. So we're still looking for some things in the future, obviously. So all of these have something to contribute. So a lot of people today are eclectic. Principles were relevant to the first audience and given in their language, but also the principles are relevant for us. Some things are past, like in Revelation 12. The child is caught up to heaven to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Most of us agree that's Jesus. That already happened. He already was caught up to heaven. And most of us agree that at least some of it is future, at least 21 and 22. Now looking at the millennium, and I'm not actually in this video going to try to defend one view over another. Well, maybe I'll give you my two favorite. But anyway, in Revelation 20, it talks about 1,000 years. So I want to just survey what some of the views have been through history. There's the premillennial view. That's the 1,000 years is still future. And Jesus comes back at the beginning, and we have 1,000 years. But there are a couple variant forms of this premillennial view. One is that the church goes through the final tribulation before that happens. Another is that the church does not go through the final tribulation before that happens. Most of the early church fathers were premillennial and post-tribulation, at least in the 2nd century. Although even then, Justin Martyr tells us not everybody agreed. But what we see from Papias, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus, 2nd century church fathers, they believed in the future 1,000 years, and they believed that they were either in the final tribulation or about to go through it. But from Augustine onward, and actually a bit before Augustine, the dominant view was the amillennial view. Actually, by the time Eusebius writes his church history in the 300s, Constantine has become the emperor, and Eusebius says, whoa, tribulation is done. God is reigning on earth through the emperor. So we're in the millennium. And he actually called, and I think this is rude, don't do this to people with different views about the end times. But he said that premillennialists are heretics. But unlike really, really heretical heretics, they can be talked out of the faith. That's not really nice. But anyway, the amillennial view became dominant, especially after Augustine. It was held by most people in the medieval church, though not all of them, still premillennialists. and Luther and Calvin were amillennial. So, people. Uh, what I'm wanting to do is make sure that whatever view you hold, you realize that there have been men and women of God through history who've held different views, and God has blessed different people's ministries with these different views. So be nice to people who hold other views. This is not one of those things. This is not a question of orthodoxy, although I do prefer correctness, and that we don't all agree on what that is. So anyway, uh, people talk about pan-millennial. Wesley, we have two millenniums, at least in his commentary on Revelation. He seems to have borrowed some material from Bengel. He thought there was a millennium on earth and a millennium in heaven. But Wesley tended towards post-millennium, which was also the view of Jonathan Edwards, a leader in the First Great Awakening, Charles Finney, a leader in the Second Great Awakening. It was the dominant view of most born-again Christians in the 19th century. During these great awakenings, when so many people were turning to Christ, I mean, they believed they were experiencing probably end time revival. They believed that what they were supposed to do was establish the kingdom of God on earth, and then the end will come. The pre-tribulational premillennial view, that is, that okay, we don't establish the kingdom on earth. That's the post-millennial view, and we also don't go through the great tribulation. That was only for Israel, and so the pre-tribulational premillennial view began to be spread, especially around 1830. John Nelson Darby as its leading exponent. And it became popular in the early to mid 20th century, especially in the early 20th century, the scope of reference Bible, the prophecy conferences, and so on. And you can see why people would like them. Different church traditions, you'll find different people holding different views. So Lutherans, you expect more of them to be amillennial because Luther was amillennial. And most Calvinists will be amillennial because Calvin was amillennial. The dominant views among current evangelical New Testament scholars, not the only views, but at least from reading the commentaries that have been published, the majority views are if they're premillennial or post-tribulation. They believe we're either in the tribulation or about to go through it. And if they're not premillennial, most of them are amillennial. And those are my two favorite. But anyway, let's go on. I have friends who are post-millennial. They don't like what I'm saying. I know it was big in the 1800s, but it kind of shattered, I think, in the reefs of realism in the early 20th century. And I expect that will happen again. How much of Revelation is literal? Well, Luther and others, they talked about finding the literal sense of Scripture. But when they talked about that, they weren't saying everything in Scripture is literal. They were saying take it according to its literary type. So narratives and letters, we normally take them literally, but we take a lot of poetry and prophecy symbolically. If you don't believe me, just take some notes reading through Old Testament prophets, reading through Song of Solomon, sure, reading through the Psalms. There's a lot of figurative language, not all, but a lot. No one takes everything in Revelation literally. For example, in Revelation 1:20, many symbols are explained in Revelation. Revelation 1:20, the seven lampstands are the seven churches. Sorry, seven lampstands are the seven churches. And the seven stars are the angels of the seven churches. If he's going to interpret symbols, chances are there are symbols that he's interpreting. Revelation 1:1, God sent and signified the book. Now, in Greek, this is a term that's related to the word sign. It's used later, like in Revelation 12, for figurative images. We usually don't take those literally. We usually don't think that there's literally this woman literally clothed with the sun with 12 stars on her head. We know too much about astronomy today to take that literally. And I don't think anybody in the first century took it literally anyway. But when God signified the book, the term doesn't have to mean this, but it often means to communicate something in symbolism, in figurative imagery. And a lot of Revelation seems to have figurative imagery in it. I mean, take Babylon, mother of prostitutes, chapter 17. Let's say I meet a prostitute on the street somewhere, and I say, "Oh, wow. Oh, I read about your mom in the Bible." Now, that's probably not the best way to introduce your witness for Christ, um, because it's not going to make sense. And, the woman clothed with the sun. On average, the Earth is maybe, 93 million miles away from the sun, something like that. If we were just half as close, let's say we were on Venus, we'd be burnt to a crisp. This woman is clothed with the sun. Okay, I think everybody's going to agree that's not meant to be literal. Some say, okay, take literally as much as possible. But who made up that rule? Isn't it better to be consistent with what we find in Revelation? If it's got a lot of symbols, maybe some of the other stuff is symbolic as well. Again, you don't have to agree that everything's symbolic, but at least, come on, be open to a lot of it being symbolic. Revelation takes over a lot of these symbols from the Old Testament, but it very often reapplies these symbols. So you've got 3 sets of 7 judgments each in the book of Revelation. You've got 7 seals, you've got the 7 trumpets, and you've got the 7 bowls. Well, the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, a lot of these judgments evoke the judgments on Egypt in the book of Exodus, including one about locusts. So, water turned to blood or wormwood. In Exodus, it's water turned to blood. Darkness is in both. Fiery hail is in both. Locusts are in both. You've got, though it's not in this chart, sores or boils in both. And deliverance by the blood of the Lamb in both. Does this mean that Revelation is just giving us a history lesson, rehearsing what happened on Egypt? Or does it mean that the future plagues are like those on Egypt? Likewise, Revelation's locusts seem to describe especially those in the book of Joel, where he speaks of a locust plague in the first couple chapters as if it's an invading army, and then turns to, in his last chapter, dealing with an invading army, more literally. But he calls both of them the day of the Lord. The first one's foreshadowing the later ones. Well, Revelation takes over a lot of the imagery of its kind of monster locusts from the book of Joel, where some of the imagery is figurative for locusts. But Revelation adds some features, earthly-ish monster locusts, perhaps. Revelation 5, 5, and 6 reapplies the image of the expected Jewish warrior Messiah. Jewish people expected a conquering, warlike Messiah who would be like a lion. Lions being king of the beasts, we say. Lions were considered the mightiest of animals. So John hears about a lion who is overcome, conquered. He turns, and what does he see? A lamb, not just any lamb, but a slain lamb. The antithesis of a powerful beast. In fact, the beast in Revelation is a bad guy. But the antithesis of a great lion. And Revelation's theology here is the same as the theology of the rest of the New Testament. That Jesus conquered, he overcame in what to the world seemed weakness, but it was the power of God through the cross. Now, similarly, some say about the 144,000. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses took that to be the first Jehovah's Witnesses, especially. But if you're going to take the number literally, you need to be consistent. They should be Jewish male virgins. If you're going to take the Jewish male virgins symbolically, then take the number symbolically as well. So when they started, they may have been partly right, saying this is the number of the saved. They've revised that to say it's the number of the, but this is the number of the saved. Chapter 7 and verse 3, a seal on the forehead of the servants of our God. Well, the servants of God everywhere else in the book of Revelation refers to all believers. How many of you are male Jewish virgins? Well, I have talked with believers in Jesus who are male Jewish virgins, but even among Messianic Jewish believers, not all of them are male Jewish virgins. Some of them are male Jewish married people, and some of them are female Jewish virgins or married people, but not all of them are male Jewish virgins. But Revelation often reapplies traditional Jewish end time images. Elsewhere in Revelation, believers are spiritually Jewish. I'm not talking about replacing the Jewish people, but being grafted in. So the churches are viewed as lampstands, which was the dominant symbol in the first century for the Jewish people. Go reading through ancient Jewish inscriptions, you see that. Believers in Jesus are viewed as grafted into the heritage of Israel. This also fits the pervasive symbolism of Revelation. Again, you don't have to think everything in Revelation is symbolic, and you don't have to agree with me on this particular example either. But there are a lot of symbols in Revelation. This could be one. Joseph's and Pharaoh's dreams. The second was another version of the first. So it's possible that in Revelation chapter 7, we've got these two groups that are depicted. The second may be an interpretation of the first. The first is 144,000 Jewish people, men from 12 tribes. The second is of an unnumbered, innumerable multitude from every kindred and tribe and people and nation. Now, why do I think that the second may be interpreting the first? Well, in the second, you've got a couple verses and from the book of Isaiah that are applied there. One is from Isaiah 25, the other is from Isaiah 49:10. They're both things that God would do for his people Israel, according to Isaiah. But in Revelation, they're applied more broadly. It's said that God and the Lamb do this, speaking of Jesus' deity. And this is the passage that's talking about people from every kindred and tribe and people and nation. So he's applying this. You have the same thing where it speaks of a kingdom and priests in Revelation 1 and Revelation 5. That goes back to Exodus 19, where it's a description of God's people. But in Revelation 5, it explicitly includes followers of Jesus from every kindred and tribe and people and nation who submitted to the Jewish Messiah and therefore have been grafted in to the heritage of God's people. Well, if that's what it means here, it parallels the reapplication of the image in chapter 5. John hears about a conquering lion. When he turns, he sees a lamb. Jesus conquers through martyrdom. And in chapter 7, John hears of this end time army. He turns and he sees, if it's an army of martyrs. Jesus' followers conquered through martyrdom. In chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, we read about these souls under the altar given white robes. And they're saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you avenge our blood that's been shed on the earth? And these souls are under the altar of sacrifice. Well, the base of the altar was where the blood of sacrifices was poured out in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. So what's that telling us? They're like sacrifices, living sacrifices, just like the lamb was sacrificed. Those who give their lives for Jesus are also living sacrifices for Jesus. And if we don't experience martyrdom for him, we can keep being living sacrifices as we live for him. But why the number 144,000 if it's being used figuratively? Well, this number is incomparably small against the world's army of 200 million. We need to depend on God, not our numbers. But more specifically, this number symbolizes the people of God, 12 squared times 10 cubed, and some Old Testament precedent for that kind of thing. But especially in Revelation 21:16, the New Jerusalem is said to be, and your translation may just put it in metric measurements or traditional English measurements, so 1,500 miles or 1,400 miles, or you may have it in kilometers. But in Greek, it's in stadia. And in Greek, it says the New Jerusalem is 12,000 stadia long and wide and high. Now, 14 or 1,500 miles is pretty high. I mean, on Mount Everest, the air is already getting thin 5 miles up. But for a high rise like this, you're going to have super duper elevators for sure. A high rise, why is it going that high? I mean, the dimensions of it are about 1/4 or 1/3 of the mass of the moon. Not that John measured the moon back then, but I mean, the floor plan alone is like France. So, it's plenty big, but notice that the wall is only 144 cubits. That's like 200 feet. Utterly disproportionate to the city itself. And here, we can call on engineers to help us. But, so God changes the laws of physics. But still, why does he use 12,144? Whether you think he changes the laws of physics there or not. Why does he use these particular numbers? Well, they remind us of 144,000, who in chapter 14 are standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb. Why are they standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb? They are the Zionites, the New Jerusalemites. They're us who are going to be with them in the New Jerusalem. This is the city of God for the people of God. Okay, you don't have to agree with me. That's my approach to it. I think it makes the most sense interpreting Revelation in light of itself at this point. The New Jerusalem is shaped like a cube. Why? Well, what in the Old Testament was shaped like a cube? The Holy of Holies. And so it's communicating what it actually says in other terms. It says that he will dwell with us and we with him. And he actually says there'll be no temple there because God himself and the Lamb will be the temple, and we will dwell in him, he and us. So it's saying that we will dwell in God's presence, maximally encountered without distraction, ever and ever. It's so awesome. I think we'll need glorified bodies to withstand that level of glory. When the glory of the Lord fell on Solomon's temple, the priests couldn't stand and minister before the Lord. But glorified bodies will be ready. Let me give one more before I go on to these. In Revelation chapter 11 and verse 8, you have the great city. Now, the great city elsewhere in the book of Revelation is called Babylon. Those of you who know geography know that Babylon is to the east of Jerusalem, quite far. But this great city is also called Sodom and Egypt. Sodom being near the Dead Sea, and Egypt, of course, being south of Jerusalem. And it's also said to be where our Lord was crucified, which, of course, was just outside of Jerusalem. Now, geographically, this doesn't make sense. It can't be literally Babylon, Jerusalem, Sodom, and Egypt. But figuratively, it makes sense. This is the object of God's judgments, like Egypt, not modern Egypt, but Egypt in the time of the Exodus experienced these plagues. And in the same way, it's not literal when it talks about Sodom, which already got burned up, but it's saying just like fire fell on Sodom, well, fire is going to fall on the wicked in the book of Revelation, or fire comes out of the mouth of one of the witnesses, or actually the witnesses, fire comes out of their mouth. So it's speaking figuratively, probably of this evil world system, evil empire like Babylon, but expressed in multiple locations. Revelation also reapplies other symbols current in its day. Now, there have been various interpretations proposed for the meaning of 666. Luther thought it was the Pope. The Pope probably thought it was Luther. In fact, the Pope at that time wasn't one of the best. But anyway, in fact, if you make up the rules as you go, say you divide by 4, add 6, multiply by 3. I mean, if you make up the rules, you can make anything come out to 666. Please don't do that to my name. You can do it to Barney the dinosaur. That's actually online. Taking the Roman numerals out of Barney, cute purple dinosaur, and adding them up, and you come out to 666. Look, Barney the dinosaur is not in this. But anyway, but in the first century, there were special rules for how to get numbers from names. Each Greek and Hebrew letter had a specific numeric value. So First Peter in Greek is actually called Petru Alpha. Second Peter is Petru Beta. They didn't have numerals in Greek or in Latin or in Hebrew. Well, they did in Latin, although they overlapped with letters there too. But in Greek and in Hebrew, the alphabet also functioned as numerals. Some had played with Nero Caesar's name in Greek, and the number of his name, coincidentally, was the same as if you added up all the letters in the sentence. He killed his mother, which incidentally he had. But if you spell Nero Caesar in Hebrew letters, it comes out to 666. There is another way to spell it, and that comes out to 616. Some of the manuscripts in Revelation, instead of saying 666, say 616, which suggests that some of them thought it was supposed to be Nero Caesar, but calculated it by spelling it differently. But anyway, could this be a coincidence? It could be, but Revelation speaks of a head wounded to death and then revived. That's a parody on Christ's resurrection. But also, after Nero died in the year 68, Romans and Jews both expected his return. You read about it in Roman historians, you read about it in Sibylline oracles. Dio Chrysostom, who was an orator speaking toward the end of the first century, said most people still think he's coming back. Some imposters even rose up claiming to be Nero. One got the Parthians to follow him and invade Asia Minor within 10 years before the book of Revelation was written. People were expecting a new Nero. By the way, this interpretation was already there in the Church Fathers. In fact, to this day, in the Armenian language, Nero is still the word for Antichrist. Now, does that mean that we should expect Nero literally to come back? No, that's not my point. But something like Nero got scary, because you know what Nero did. Revelation 17 also warns of a coming evil emperor. Of 7 kings, one was, but is not, but is to come. That's a parody on the one who was, who is, and who is to come. But also the king was one of the 7 before the current one. So the current one is Domitian, according to the most likely dating of the book of Revelation, also following Church Fathers there. But all the previous emperors were dead. So it's like really, really spooky now. If you count back from Domitian, if you skip the 3 interim usurpers, like you would in the Eastern Mediterranean, Nero was one of the 7. If you date Revelation earlier, then Nero is one of the 7. But almost everything in Revelation is 7, and 12, once in a while 4, but mostly 7. So Revelation says this king who was, even though there's no ones that were that still are, is coming back. Does this mean we should look for a literal new Nero? Probably no more than for a literal Moses or literal Elijah in chapter 11, where you have the 2 witnesses, prophetic figures doing things kind of like Moses and Elijah, turning water into blood, and, well, not calling fire from heaven, but spurting it out of their mouth, which probably is not talking about the lack of use of the stream. He's not probably saying that these are going to be the literal plagues of literal Moses on literal Egypt again. figurative Egypt, Sodom slash Babylon slash Jerusalem, the world. He's probably saying not literally this, but he's going to be like Nero, the Nero that lots of people expected. So using the ancient headlines instead of the modern ones. Nero burned Christians alive to light his imperial gardens at night and massacred others of them other ways, feeding them to beasts for public display. So Revelation is warning it's going to get worse before it gets better. It would be like somebody today saying you thought Hitler was bad, or Pol Pot, Stalin, or the King Leopold, who exploited the Belgian Congo for slave labor. Lots of evil in history, lots of Antichrist figures in history. If you love Jesus, and this isn't new to Revelation, I mean, you've already got it in the Gospels, you've got it in false teaching. If you love Jesus, you better be ready to die for him. The mark of the beast, what's that? Well, look, if somebody wants to put a literal mark on their forehead and says you can't buy or sell without this, I don't think I would want them to do that. I would be very suspicious that they got the idea from Revelation and they're really bad guys. But the mark of the beast in Revelation, well, notice it's not the only thing written on people in the book of Revelation. Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18, talks about the name of the beast or his number being written on the forehead or the hand of those who belong to him. But there were no chapter breaks in the original. So going on into chapter 14, verse 1, right after he said this, in contrast to those who bear the mark of the beast, are those who have the name of the Lamb written on them. You got to serve somebody. Choose this day whom you will serve. Are you going to serve the beast? Or are you going to serve the Lamb? Hey, if you're into this world's idea of power, beasts are ferocious. If you care about God's kingdom, better follow the Lamb. Maybe not ferocious. The future belongs to the Lamb. So does all of history, for that matter, as we see when he opens the seals. Chapter 22, verse 3. We will serve him. And in verse 4, his name will be on our foreheads. The Lamb's name. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 12. For those who serve the Lord, they will be pillars in the temple of God in New Jerusalem. And on them will be written the name of God in New Jerusalem. Will be literal pillars. But people often wrote inscriptions on pillars. So is it literally a name that we see written physically, or is it spiritually written and God sees it? Maybe we'll see it too, I don't know, but let's look at these. You have the name written on the prostitute in chapter 17. Mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes. Is she literal? I mean, she's the embodiment of the evil empire. She's not herself actually a specific woman. And then we have Jesus coming back. He's literal, but he has a name written on his thigh that no one knows except him. So is that literal, or is it because John is having visions, he knows how to read, and therefore this is part of the vision to show him who this is? Well, so the mark of the beast in Revelation is pretty much a sign of ownership. You either belong to God or you belong to the devil. You belong to the Lamb or you belong to the beast. And so it calls us to choose our sides. Now, in the final tribulation, and actually it's happened in history before, where people have required people to get certificates before they can buy and sell, that they offered incense to an emperor or something. If that happens again, well, obviously stay loyal to God. Whether it has to be literal or not, though, doesn't affect the application of it and how we preach it to every generation. Be loyal to Jesus and be more impressed with the power of the Lamb than the power of the beast of this world. What does Revelation mean by Babylon? Well, Revelation tells us, gives us a lot of clues that would have made it obvious in the first century what the Babylon of Revelation's day was. It's the city on 7 hills or 7 mountains. Now, if you don't believe me, just go randomly start reading through Roman literature. And sooner or later, you're going to run into this. Everyone knew that Rome was called the city on 7 hills or 7 mountains. They even had an annual festival called the Septimontium, which was an annual festival celebrating, as its name indicates, Rome's founding on 7 hills or 7 mountains. There were a few cities that adopted that name later in antiquity based on Rome. But I mean, the pervasive use of it, especially in John's day, was for Rome. It's said to be the city that ruled over the kings of the earth. Well, Rome did not rule over all the kings of the earth, didn't rule over China, didn't rule over India, didn't rule over Nubia, didn't rule over a lot of places. But in terms of within the Roman Empire, in places like the 7 churches in Asia Minor, when they thought of the empire that ruled over the kingdoms of the earth and the kings of the earth, well, they were exposed regularly to Roman imperial propaganda. Rome rules the kings of the earth, even though Rome knew very well that they didn't rule Parthia, whom I mentioned earlier. The Parthian king claimed to rule over the kings of the earth. His official title, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, just like Nebuchadnezzar, one of his predecessors in the Old Testament. So the city that ruled over the kings of the earth, that one may be a little bit more ambiguous, but for the 7 churches in Asia Minor, they probably get the point. It's also a mercantile power, which Parthia was not. And this mercantile power in Revelation 18, it trades in exactly the merchandise that we know Rome traded in from the work of many of the elders, natural history, writing in the 60s, no, I think he's writing this in the 70s. And he describes the imports to Rome. Well, the list overlaps like so much with this list. Some of the imports are not things that many people today would care about importing, but these were the things that Rome was importing. More importantly, Rome oppressed Israel like Babylon did. It destroyed the temple like Babylon did. And Jewish people looking at the book of Daniel, they said 4 empires, 4 evil empires. First one is Babylon. Fourth one, as they interpreted it in the first century, there's debates about what it was understood as earlier, but in the first century, pretty much all the Jewish people understood this as being Rome. So they understood Rome as a new Babylon, already from the book of Daniel. 1 Peter 5:13 seems to also speak of a letter being sent from Rome as being sent from Babylon. The Jewish literature from Revelation's era, especially after the year 70, after the temple was destroyed, regularly spoke of Rome as a new Babylon. But lest we think that Rome was the only Babylon, if there could be a new Babylon in John's day, there could also be other new Babylons. In Revelation 13, we read about this beast. We read about 2 beasts, but the first beast we read about there, it takes imagery from Daniel chapter 7. But in Daniel chapter 7, you've got 4 beasts representing 4 evil empires. The one after the beasts is the Son of Man, representing God's kingdom. These 4 beasts represent 4 empires. They're all blended together in Revelation 13. So Revelation 13 is not just talking about Rome. It's talking about the spirit of evil empire in general. Look at the news. Evil empires today. There were evil empires in the 1800s when prophecy teachers were pinpointing them then. Through history, all evil empires have fallen and now lie in the dust. The same will be true of today's empires, economic empires or military empires, whatever, that exploit people, that do evil that other people are afraid of. And they're afraid, okay, we better do what they say. We better take their mark or whatever, follow what they say because they have so much power, like a beast. Antichrist rise and fall, but the ultimate future doesn't belong to them. Revelation tells us about the time that's coming when the kingdom of this world will become the kingdom of our God, Jesus Christ. In John's day, the mightiest empire the world had ever known, at least his part of the world had ever known, seemed poised to crush the tiny church of God, which again constituted less than 0.1% of the Roman Empire. But John hears a funeral dirge over this empire in Revelation chapter 18, borrowing language from Isaiah and Jeremiah about the first Babylon. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. John, this exiled prophet, banished to the island of Patmos, has the audacity to recount a funeral dirge over the very empire that had banished him. And yet Rome has now been fallen for over 15 centuries. But the Church of Jesus Christ is alive and well. In fact, just over the past century, the shift of Christian population in the world has been extraordinary. Where the majority of Christians by far were in what we call the West a century ago. There were Christians in other places too, but the majority. Today, the balance has shifted. The majority of Christians today live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, by far the majority. And it continues to shift in that direction. Not saying give up on the West. Hey, let's proclaim Jesus everywhere. But saying John speaks of people before the throne of God from every kindred and tribe and people and nation. Guess what? It's happening. John was a prophet indeed. Revelation includes a tale of two cities, Babylon the prostitute, New Jerusalem the bride. Babylon is decked with gold and pearls. The New Jerusalem is like a bride adorned for her husband. The streets are of gold. The city is of gold. The gates are of pearls. The contrast seems deliberate. I mean, in Revelation, I'm not going to go through all of these details, but just to show you the geographic diversity of where Rome was getting all of the things from. They had trade ties, of course, importing silk from China. Ships went as far as Vietnam in the 2nd century. We have records of these things, and also a lot of trade with Africa further south, including they found a bust of Caesar as far south as Tanzania. So Rome was getting a lot of goods, but a lot of it was from exploitation of people. Even the wheat that they were importing into Rome, they were importing hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat into Rome, especially from North Africa and especially Egypt in North Africa, while the childhood mortality rate in Egypt, according to my papyrology professor at Duke, was close to 50% because of the grinding poverty in Egypt in this period. It had once been a mighty empire itself, but oppressed under Rome, so that the people of Rome could have a free grain dole every month to keep peace in the capital, a capital that was exploiting some of the other parts of the empire. We could go into a lot more detail about that. The list in Revelation 18 about what they were exploiting, how they were getting their goods, climaxes with two things: human bodies and souls. That was Rome's slave trade. God cares about economic injustice. And then going on to speak of the blood of the martyrs, their oppression of God's church. Rome was the Babylon of John's day. Rome could be decorated with gold and pearls. The world system described in Revelation like a prostitute, but not a very attractive one. Back then, uh, on brothels on the walls, you know this from Pompeii, they would often scratch pictures of different prostitutes, and according to their views of beauty back then, people would be charged more for some than for others, really exploiting the women, most of them slave prostitutes. But look at who Babylon looks like in the book of Revelation. She looks like her dad. The dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns. Well, that's what Babylon also looks like. The beast on which the woman sits. Anyway, isn't evil lovely when you see what she really looks like? He really looks like. It really looks like. But we have this contrast between Babylon and the New Jerusalem, between the prostitute and the bride. Those who live for the temporary gratification of this world, well, they get their gratification in this world. But those who are willing to endure for the promise of the world to come, that takes faith. But if we're willing to not settle for temporary gratification, instead of being joined with the prostitute, we need to be the bride of Christ. And the great city of this world, Babylon, has nothing. And the greater city, the New Jerusalem, 12,000 stadia, huge. Now, I'm going to come to one less known but common scholarly view of Revelation's time structure regarding what's the timing of the Great Tribulation. Whether you agree with it or not, again, it's good to at least know about it, to know that this is a major view. Now, for amillennialists, the tribulation is basically the same time as the millennium, viewed from a different perspective. For premillennialists, it's different from the millennium, different from the 1,000 years. But we'll talk about the time structure of Revelation. So whichever view you hold on that, the time structure is still relevant. When does the period end? Well, you've got the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls of anger, and each of them climax with what looks like the end of the age. You've got mountains and islands moved from their places. You've got the stars falling to earth. Obviously, that's not astronomy, but very graphic imagery from cosmic renovation, cosmic transformation. You have Armageddon. So the 6th and the 7th seal, trumpet, and bowl of anger all represent not just the kind of events that happen every other week, but these are climactic, cataclysmic events. So it looks like they all end at the same time, or roughly at the same time, when Jesus comes back. Revelation 19 looks, at least to me, like Jesus comes back there. And how long is the period? Well, in Revelation, in different passages, it's called 1260 days, 42 months, times, and half the time. These images are borrowed from Daniel. There's not much disagreement about that, except that 1260 becomes 1290. And in Daniel, it's the final half of the 70th 7 of years, so the final 3.5 years. Some people add up 2 of the 3.5-year periods, although there's more like 3 in the book of Revelation, 3 or 4. You add them all up, you get a really longer period, but if you add up 2 of them, you get a 7-year period. But probably all these 3.5-year periods are talking about the same thing in the book of Revelation. So probably we're talking about 3.5 years. But does Revelation mean the same thing by this 3.5-year period that Daniel means? And here's where it gets more controversial, although some would already be upset that I said it's probably 3.5, 5.7. But remember that Revelation often reapplies Old Testament symbols. If Revelation reapplies the symbol, what end time picture did he have in mind? Daniel meant a period of great tribulation. Revelation might use the number to tell us about the kind of time and not just the length of time. Well, actually, it does tell us about the kind of time, but it is a period of great tribulation. But whether it also means the length of time, that's where the dispute is at this point. Revelation might speak, or Revelation does speak, of a time of suffering. Daniel's prophecy actually reframed Jeremiah's earlier prophecy. And we're about to get a little complicated, but for some of you, this is like old hat. For many of you, this is like new hat. But Jeremiah prophesied restoration after 70 years. Well, a partial restoration happened then, but Daniel said, this can't be all there is. God said to Daniel, altogether it's 70 sabbatic years, that is 70 weeks, 77s of years. So 490 years altogether. Jesus spoke directly of Daniel's prophecy and said there would be an abomination of desolation within a generation. That's also disputed. I'm not even going to go there now because that's another passage besides Revelation. I'm trying to keep this fairly concise. Well, how does this function in the book of Revelation? Look explicitly at what it says in Revelation 12, verses 5 and 6. Notice the sequence. The child is caught up to God and to his throne to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Most of us believe that's talking about Jesus, which is usually the right answer in Sunday school too. And then the woman flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days. Now, there could be a gap between the child being caught up and the woman fleeing in this period of tribulation, but there's no gap stated. So the next thing we see on this prophetic chronology is after Jesus is exalted, the tribulation begins. Now, we could go into some of the other details about this, but just to say, this doesn't necessarily rule out a final period of tribulation. In fact, it can't, because if this whole age is tribulation, whatever comes last has to be final. But it does suggest that, at least in some sense, believers experience that tribulation or a foreshadowing of it now. God's people have been persecuted from the beginning. So already by the time Revelation is written, the abomination of desolation that Jesus spoke about within a generation had already been fulfilled. So Revelation may be looking to a different aspect of this, how the principle continues of great tribulation through history. And like 1 John 2:18, you've heard that an Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists. We live in a time where things often get rough for God's people. I could cite places where we have brothers and sisters being killed on a regular basis, where I'm in touch with brothers and sisters who are letting me know some of these things as they are happening, and other places where they're facing all sorts of other sufferings. My wife was a refugee for 18 months in a war in her country. So really bad things have been happening all through history. And can it get worse? I'm afraid maybe it can. But Jesus gives us a message about that. And he says, in this world you will have tribulation. Be of good courage. I have overcome the world. Now again, elsewhere in the New Testament, when does the end time begin? Well, we've been in it for a while. And so Revelation may have a particular take on this particular expression of the Great Tribulation, except the plagues don't come just on ancient Egypt, Pharaonic Egypt in Moses' day, but they come on the world. And it's not fire coming from heaven just on Sodom a long time ago, but judgment comes on this world. So some argue that Revelation reframes tribulation Christocentrically, Now it describes the whole period between the first and the second coming, the end time. We live in an eschatological time. We live in the last days. Yes, we may or may not be in the last years. We may or may not be the last day, the last hour. We'll know within an hour, right? But we've been in the last days since the day of Pentecost. And so we live in an eschatologically pregnant time. We need to live like the end time people of God. We need to be ready to proclaim Jesus Christ to the nations, no matter what it costs us. Just like we see God's people doing in Revelation chapter 12, where it says that they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives, even to the death. Now, this is a view held by historic premillennialists and all amillennialists. Difference is the millennium. But the basic principle here, and even by some people who don't share those particular views, the basic principle here is live for Jesus with all you. Whether or not you agree with the details, we can still learn from the principles, from God's ways in the book of Revelation, just as from the Old Testament. Revelation really is a very practical book, but its message cuts two ways. It's an encouragement to suffering Christians like those in Smyrna and Philadelphia, but it's a threat to lukewarm Laodicean Christians. Jesus is coming. Get ready.